She looks so cute, just like you and me.
While visiting the maternity ward to celebrate Natalie's childbirth, I heard a familiar voice coming from the room next door. That voice, unmistakably, belonged to my husband, David. Realizing the truth, I quietly locked the door to Natalie's hospital room. I couldn't just turn a blind eye to what was happening. I decided to take revenge on David and called his parents. My name is Rachel Smith, a 46-year-old office worker. I met David, who is a year younger than me, through work, and we eventually started dating. Not long after we began dating, I found out I was pregnant, and within 6 months, we got married. My parents were furious at me at the time. Now, as a mother to my son, I deeply understand how they must have felt. However, I loved David, and I didn't think the length of our relationship mattered. In reality, I believe we supported each other and got along well. David was thoughtful, especially when I was exhausted from raising our son, and he would take the lead in household chores. Thanks to him, our son, Chris, grew up healthy and successfully graduated from college. After graduating, Chris married Natalie, his girlfriend since his high school. Life seemed to be on track, but I had one concern. When Chris left home to attend college, I started noticing changes in David's behavior. He began working more overtime and weekends, and he was hardly ever home. Even when he was home, he was always on his phone, and we barely had any conversations as a couple. How about we go out together sometime? Maybe over the next long weekend?
I'm too tired from work. If you want to go, why don't you invite someone else?
David's response was cold, and he never accepted my invitations. It might be natural after nearly 20 years together. But when Chris left home, we finally had time as a couple again. I was hoping we could go on dates or take trips together like we did when we were newlyweds, so I was a bit shocked. Maybe we could never go back to how happy we once were. Now, it feels like we're just pretending to be a couple. Over time, David and I spoke less and less, and even when we were together, we only exchanged the bare minimum. No matter what I said, David's responses were dull, and sometimes he would outright ignore me. I knew I couldn't let things stay like this, but I couldn't bring myself to take action and buried myself in work every day. There were days when I found myself wondering why I was even working so hard. During those times, I would occasionally spend money to help Chris and Natalie. Since they had only recently started their careers, I knew they probably didn't have much savings, and I wanted to support them however I could. I bought them furniture and appliances for their home, and sometimes sent them groceries or other necessities, but David wasn't pleased.
Why are you spending our money without asking me? We should be saving it for our future. Chris has a job, so he doesn't need our help. You're spoiling him way too much.
I understand what you're saying, but as a parent, I want to do what I can for Chris. I'm not indulging in luxuries, and helping Chris is one of the things that gives me purpose. I just want to see him happy. Since I rarely spent money on anything other than necessities, I thought it was fine to use some for Chris. Besides, I had already set aside our savings, so David had no reason to argue. However, no matter how much I explained, David wouldn't agree.
If I say no, then it's no. If you can't follow my rules, you're welcome to leave. This is my house, so you should abide by my rules.
David wouldn't listen to my opinion and kept boasting about how the house was under his name. Even if it was in his name, I had contributed to the mortgage, and part of the household expenses were covered by my income. I was growing increasingly tired of David's overbearing attitude. One day my phone rang. It was a call from Chris telling me that Natalie was expecting a baby. I was overjoyed at the news of our first grandchild. I wanted to share the news with David, so I spoke to him. Guess what? Natalie is pregnant. We're going to have a grandchild. Before I could finish, David interrupted with harsh words.
Another story about Chris. You're always going on about him. They're married, so of course they'd have a kid or two. You're making such a big deal out of nothing.
Hearing David's response, I didn't feel like continuing the conversation and walked away. How can he not be genuinely happy about the birth of his grandchild? What kind of parent is he? It felt like David had no interest in Chris. But given his behavior over the years, I wasn't even surprised anymore. David didn't care about family at all. From then on, I decided not to bring up Chris in conversations with him. I felt both sad and resigned, but I figured it was better to stay silent than to get upset by his reactions.
I'll be working late tonight, and I might stay overnight at the office.
He seemed to be increasingly busy with work, often coming home at dawn or staying at the office overnight. But I didn't believe him. The reason was that his parents, George and Ashley, ran the company where David worked, and I often heard about work-related matters from them. According to them, there's hardly any overtime. They also said staying overnight at the office is impossible. Where could David be going, lying to me like this? Could he be cheating? I sometimes wondered about it, but I knew confronting him wouldn't make him confess. Besides, with our marriage already broken, I had no energy to hire a private investigator or dig into it further. I figured David was taking advantage of my silence to do as he pleased. I had thought about discussing it with George and Ashley several times, but I could never find the right timing to bring it up. After some time, I got a call from Chris telling me that Natalie had given birth. I debated whether I should tell David, but in the end, I didn't. He'd probably just dismiss it, saying he wasn't interested. I'm going to visit Natalie. Do you want to come? I asked David, trying to gauge his reaction, but as expected, his response was cold.
I'm busy with work. I have somewhere I need to be today. If you care so much about Chris and Natalie, why don't you just stay there?
I was starting to feel a strong sense of disgust toward David. Technically, it was his day off, so his excuse about work was obviously a lie. Does he really think he can fool me with such an obvious lie? The word divorce flickered in my mind, but it wasn't the right time to bring it up. For now, being there for Chris and Natalie was more important to me. Since David insisted he was working, I prepared a lunchbox for him and left the house. Chris told me the room number, and I hurried to the hospital. It was about an hour away by train, but my excitement to meet my first grandchild made the trip fly by. When I arrived at the hospital and headed toward Natalie's room, I happened to run into Chris at the entrance. He had just returned from a nearby convenience store.
Natalie's resting in her room now. She worked so hard, so make sure to say something nice to her. Wait, isn't Dad coming?
David said he had work. He's really disappointed he couldn't make it. I couldn't bring myself to repeat David's exact words to Chris, so I lied instead. There was no way I could tell him that David seemed completely uninterested in Natalie's childbirth. Seeing the sadness on Chris's face made my heart ache. Why can't he show some care for his own son, Chris? Slowly but surely, Anger toward David began to boil within me.
Isn't he adorable? Do you think he looks like me?
Chris beamed as he pointed at the baby through the nursery window. Perhaps I was biased, but among all the newborns, my grandchild looked the cutest. It was a boy, and as I gazed at him, I hoped he'd grow up to be as kind and sincere as Chris. After spending some time admiring my grandchild, Chris and I headed to Natalie's room. Congratulations on the birth. Make sure to rest well for a while. This is an important time, so don't push yourself and rely on Chris when you need to.
Thank you so much. Chris has been so attentive, almost overly protective, but I plan to lean on him while I can.
As we were enjoying our conversation, we heard voices coming from the room next door. It seemed like someone there had just given birth as well. Since the doors to the rooms were open, the voices carried through. Did the person next door also have a baby?
It sounds like it. They probably gave birth earlier this morning when the labor started.
Hearing that brought back memories of my own delivery. I recalled going into labor late at night, unable to reach David or other family members, feeling so lonely. It's something I can laugh about now, but at the time, it was my first delivery, and I was so anxious. Natalie and I started talking about the challenges of childbirth. At that moment, I heard a familiar voice from the next room.
She looks so cute, just like you and me.
The voice sounded just like David's. But there was no way David could be here. Besides, it wasn't possible for David to have another child, so I assumed it must be a mistake. I tried to dismiss it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was David's voice, and I found myself straining to listen.
I'm sorry I couldn't be there for the delivery. Just take it easy now, and don't overdo it. Let me know if there's anything I can do for you.
The man who sounded like David was speaking gently to the woman who had just given birth. I couldn't believe the possibility that my husband David had fathered a child with another woman, and that the child had been born today. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, but I couldn't stop feeling uneasy, convinced it had to be David.
Rachel? Is something wrong?
No, I just thought the man next door sounded familiar, but it must be a coincidence. I tried to downplay it so Natalie wouldn't notice, but her reaction surprised me.
Doesn't that sound like David? What do you think, Chris?
It really does sound like Dad, but there's no way Dad could have a baby with someone else. Should I go check the room next door?
I quickly stopped Chris from going next door. Don't, I'll handle this. You stay here. Then I quietly locked the door to Natalie's room. The last thing I wanted was for David to notice us and create a scene. Natalie had just given birth and needed to rest. I decided to call David's parents, George and Ashley, to come to the hospital. I couldn't let David continue unchecked. When I briefly explained the situation to George and Ashley, they were shocked and promised to come to the hospital immediately. We decided to stay in the hospital room while waiting for George and Ashley to arrive. Luckily, the hospital was close to their house, so they called to say they'd be there in about 15 minutes. In about 3 minutes, we came up with a plan, and it was decided that George and Ashley would confront the people in the room next door. I stayed in the hallway, out of sight, to record the conversation. I told Chris and Natalie to stay in her hospital room and wait.
I can't believe Dad is having an affair.
This is unbelievable. And his mistress had a baby? I can't make sense of this at all.
Chris and Natalie were shocked and confused about David's apparent infidelity. Meanwhile, George and Ashley remained unusually calm. Finally, they approached the room where David was and barged in.
So I hear a child who looks like you was just born. That must be a problem for you, don't you think?
Ashley spoke calmly, but her words had a sharp edge. If I had been alone, I might not have been able to confront David so firmly. I felt truly grateful to have George and Ashley there.
What are you doing here, Mom? That's my child. No, wait, it's not what it looks like.
What do you mean, not what it looks like? You've been cheating all this time, haven't you? We've turned a blind eye until now. But to father a child? That's unacceptable. I'm ashamed of you.
George's words hit me hard. It seemed that George and Ashley had already suspected David's affair. Were they shielding me from the truth to protect David? At that moment, I couldn't fully grasp George and Ashley's intentions. But if they wanted to protect David, they wouldn't have barged into the room like this. While I was puzzled, I decided to observe their actions for now.
You ignored it all this time because you thought it was fine for me to have an affair, right? So why are you blaming me now? Chris is an adult, and my marriage with Rachel has already fallen apart. I'm free to do as I please.
Hello, George and Ashley. My name is Mary. I'm engaged to David. I understand he's planning to divorce Rachel, so there shouldn't be any issue, right? I didn't ruin their family, and I don't feel like I've done anything wrong.
I was stunned to hear that David was considering divorce, something he'd never mentioned to me. And Mary boldly declared she planned to marry him. What struck me most was that Mary's voice sounded familiar. I couldn't immediately place it, but I was sure I'd heard it before. As I dug through my memories, one woman came to mind. That woman is David's coworker at his company. In other words, she's an employee at George and Ashley's company.
I won't approve of your marriage. Having an affair within our company is a serious issue. If you want to get married, there's no way we can hand the company over to David. I can't entrust the business to someone who cheats.
Dad, hold on a second. Did you even listen to what I said? Things with Rachel are already over, so this isn't even an affair.
Have you told Rachel? Are you moving forward with the divorce?
David kept insisting it wasn't an affair and refused to admit any wrongdoing. I was at my limit with his attitude. Then, George's words completely changed the atmosphere in the room.
Wait, David, you haven't started the divorce process yet. That's not what we were told. Didn't you promise Rachel that you'd file for divorce once Chris became an adult?
Well, I mean, that's my intention. I haven't talked to Rachel about it yet, but I plan to.
Hearing this exchange, I couldn't hold back any longer and burst into the room. I realized I couldn't continue with David any longer. I decided then and there to demand a divorce myself. You were planning to divorce me once Chris became an adult, so that's what you've been thinking. Do you know why I'm here?
Rachel, I don't know. Were you following me?
David's response showed just how self-centered he was. I wanted to tell him I wasn't so free as to waste time tailing him, but arguing seemed pointless, so I held my tongue. I was in the room next door. I came to see the baby.
The baby? Wait, is it my baby? Did you know a child was going to be born? Or was it you who gave birth? No, that's impossible.
David's words made no sense, showing he couldn't comprehend the situation. Whether he ignored or forgot about Natalie's pregnancy, it was clear the thought of her giving birth hadn't even crossed his mind. Chris and Natalie's baby was born, and on the same day, your child was born as well. I can hardly believe such a coincidence.
Oh, Chris's baby? So that's why you're here at the hospital.
David seemed oddly relieved to learn why we were at the hospital. Do you understand the situation you're in right now? If you want a divorce, I'll give you one. But in return, I'll demand alimony from both of you.
Why should I have to pay alimony? Our marriage was already cold and dead, so it's not my fault we're divorcing.
David refused to pay alimony and insisted his affair wasn't the cause of the divorce. However, Ashley revealed a shocking truth.
You've been involved with her for 10 years, haven't you? One of the other employees told me about it. They said it was because you got tired of Rachel. And as long as you're married to Rachel, cheating is still cheating. You need to take responsibility.
Who said that? Our relationship ended 10 years ago. I only stayed for Chris's sake. There's no reason I should have to pay alimony.
I had no idea the affair had been going on for 10 years. Since David's behavior only changed in recent years, I was deeply shocked. Learning I'd been deceived for a decade filled me with despair. What was my marriage even about? I won't feel satisfied until I've dragged David down completely.
If paying alimony will get you a divorce, then just pay it. I'll pay too because we're the ones who did something wrong. For the sake of the baby, you need to take responsibility.
Even if you say that, if a baby hadn't been born, this wouldn't have come out. Why didn't you take something to avoid getting pregnant?
Everyone was stunned by David's words. Seeing David shift the blame onto Mary while ignoring his own infidelity, I felt all affection and even the slightest sympathy for him vanish completely. I couldn't understand why I had ever loved such a man. I even felt sorry for Mary, who had been trapped by someone as despicable as David. Despite the affair, she had borne his child, only to be told that the baby shouldn't have been born. It was beyond cruel. David and Mary began arguing, while George, Ashley, and I stood by in disbelief, watching the scene unfold. Whatever happens between you two, the divorce is final, and I'll be expecting alimony from both of you.
Everything's ruined. I've been doing everything I could to avoid paying alimony, and now it's all your fault. You should pay my share of the alimony too.
David's attempt to shift all the blame onto Mary was so absurd it was almost laughable.
Enough is enough. You're fired. Don't bother coming to the company anymore, and don't ever show your face in front of us again.
Well, it can't be helped. Should we just fire both of them? Infidelity isn't one-sided after all. And I'm cutting all family ties with you. It's humiliating to have a son like you.
George and Ashley declared both David and Mary fired, and Ashley went as far as to disown David. This turn of events was beyond anything I had anticipated, but I was completely satisfied. Serves you right. That was the only thought running through my mind as I watched David hang his head in defeat. It seemed unlikely that things would work out between David and Mary either.
Please, let me stay with the company. I won't even ask to inherit it in the future. Just don't fire me. I'll break things off with Mary, so please only fire her, not me.
Mary was devastated by David's words and burst into tears. She was trying to say something, but her sobbing made it impossible to understand. I couldn't fathom how David could hurt so many people without a second thought. Realizing that continuing the conversation was pointless, I decided to leave the room, only to find Chris standing at the entrance.
Dad, you're the worst. I used to look up to you, but it was all a lie, wasn't it? I can't even bear the thought of you being my dad anymore. I'm cutting ties with you too.
Chris, what are you saying? I've worked so hard to raise you. How dare you talk to your father like that?
Chris looked more exasperated than angry. He had seen the entire scene unfold and knew everything that had been said. Abandoned even by his own son, David resorted to wielding his parental authority in a futile outburst. But anyone could see that Chris was in the right.
Let's just leave him and go home. Once you divorce him, he's not family anymore, right? There's no reason to care about him.
You're right, George Ashley. Let's leave too. Staying here will only bring more unpleasantness. We turned to leave, leaving David and Mary behind in the hospital room. However, David, clearly unable to accept what was happening, called out to stop us.
Wait a minute. We're not done talking yet. I don't care about this woman at all. I only came to the hospital because I had to since a baby was born. That's all there is to it.
You're absolutely despicable. I don't want to hear any more excuses. At the very least, you could offer an apology for cheating.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I realize now I shouldn't have cheated. I really regret it, so please forgive me.
David's sudden change in attitude and his apology were clearly aimed at gaining forgiveness. But it was too late for that. There was only one reason David was apologizing. It wasn't because he wanted to continue our relationship. He was apologizing to avoid being fired from George and Ashley's company. It doesn't matter what happens to you anymore. We can't be a family any longer. Didn't you see this coming? Did you think you could cheat and face no consequences? From now on, I'll handle everything through a lawyer, and don't bother coming back home. With that, I left the room. George, Ashley, and Chris followed me out. I thought David might try to chase after us, but he just sat slumped in a chair, staring at the floor. We stopped by Natalie's room to let her know we were leaving.
Is everything okay? What happened?
Natalie looked puzzled, probably because we all looked so grim. Since the door to her room had been closed, she likely hadn't heard any of the conversation. I'll explain once things settle down. For now, don't worry about anything and just rest, okay? I didn't go into detail, but I felt like Natalie had an idea of what had happened. In the end, David and I got divorced. The recording from the hospital became evidence, and I demanded alimony of $30,000 from David and Mary. Although they initially resisted, they eventually paid the full amount in one lump sum. After dividing our assets, David ended up with a negative balance due to the alimony payment. The house where I had lived with David was sold, and I decided to move back to my family home. True to their word, George and Ashley fired both David and Mary from the company. David lost his job and was abandoned by his family. He no longer had anyone to rely on. He begged Mary for support, but she wouldn't have it, and the two eventually broke up. Mary decided to raise their child on her own, and David was reportedly ordered to pay $500 a month in child support. As a result, David fell into debt and now works temporary jobs to repay his loans. However, since these are day jobs, there are days when he has no work, making his income unstable. Even so, he must pay off his debts and child support. David contacted me once, asking for financial help, but I ignored him. We're divorced, and I have no reason to assist him. I don't know how David is living now. I don't care where he is or what he's doing, but I do hope he's turned his life around and is living honestly. I moved back to my family home and started a new life. Chris occasionally visits with my grandson, and that's my only joy these days. Although I thought I would no longer have any ties to George and Ashley, they approached Chris after deciding that David wouldn't inherit the company.
I don't think I'd be of any use since I have no knowledge of business management. Wouldn't it be better to find someone among your current employees to take over the company?
You don't need any prior knowledge. We want to leave the company to someone we can trust. Ideally, it would have been a family member, but David is useless. If he had taken over, the next successor would have been you. You can always learn about management from now on. Would you consider taking over our company?
This conversation apparently happened several times. However, Chris seems to want to sever ties with George and Ashley because of my divorce from David. Don't worry about me. Just do what you want to do. I want Chris to live his life as he chooses. That is my wish now.